One by one, territories joined together, creating a patchwork nation of 50 different states, united, but each with its own history, spirit, culture, and landmarks. Let's explore the history of 5 of them. Michigan, Tennessee, Maine, Missouri, and South Dakota. Welcome to the states. This first state is surrounded by 4 of the 5 Great Lakes, giving it the longest freshwater shoreline in the world. In fact, no one who lives here is ever more than 85 miles from open water. Greetings from Michigan, which became America's 26th state on the 26th of January, 1837. Over 10 million people call Michigan home, making it the 8th most populous state in the nation.
Michigan folks are called Michiganders. There was a time when, because of the word gander and goose, they considered Michigonian. I don't think that cut any ice. I don't think that was very appealing to people. So we're still, as far as I know, we're still Michiganders.
Ask any native Michigander exactly where in Michigan they're from, and more than likely you'll be offered the hand.
If you look at a map of the United States, it's easy to find Michigan because we're the only one that looks like a hand. It's what we sometimes call the mitten state.
I'm like the east side of Detroit, right about here.
I'm from Holland, Michigan, and Holland is right here.
I am from here, which is Jackson, Michigan.
Manistee between Grand Rapids and Traverse City. Mackinac Island's out here.
Michigan's handprint is encircled by 4 of the Great Lakes: Superior to the north, Michigan to the west, Huron and Erie to the east. It was the Great Lakes and their tributaries that attracted Michigan's earliest settlers, many of whom came from New England, which may explain why Michigan has a New Haven, a Bennington, and a Vermontville. 2 of those New Englanders who helped put Michigan on the map were brothers John and Will Kellogg. While trying to invent a dietary substitute for bread, they forced a batch of dry dough through steel rollers and changed breakfast forever. The Kellogg's marketed their creation as cornflakes. Michigan also gives us more cherries than any other state and is the nation's 3rd leading grower of Christmas trees. It has the most lighthouses, with 150, and is one of 4 states that still offers mail delivery by boat. But all of that takes a back seat to the industry that has fueled Michigan's economy for years: making cars.
The auto industry developed at a very, very rapid pace in the very first decade of the 20th century, largely because of the work of Henry Ford. And it really became the dominant industry, not only in the Detroit area, but in the state of Michigan generally. People think about the Motor City, but the state is really the Motor State.
Michigan is the headquarters of America's big 3 automakers: Ford, General Motors, and Daimler Chrysler. The fluctuating fortunes of these industrial giants can have a statewide impact.
In good times, Michigan tends to be one of the states with the lowest unemployment rate in the country. On the other hand, because of the manufacturing sector's reliance on consumers, when consumer demand begins to wane, many people are thrown out of work. And in those bad times, Michigan's unemployment rate generally does not mirror the nation at large. It always surpasses it.
For one former auto worker, the job insecurity was motivation to borrow $800 and start his own business. His name was Berry Gordy. The business? Motown Records.
The company was founded in 1959, and it essentially started here at the Hitsville facility. And Mr. Gordy was a singer and producer and songwriter, and he was able to take this raw talent from the city of Detroit and turning them into superstars and selling millions of records.
Berry Gordy's family had come to Michigan from Georgia in 1922 as part of what's known as the Great Migration. In the years between 1910 and 1930, more than 1 million African Americans relocated from the South to northern industrial centers like Detroit, which saw a 20% increase in its black population. Many came in search of better jobs at Michigan's factories. Those same opportunities also lured large groups of immigrants from around the world. Polish people are the largest ethnic group in the state, with many centered around the town of Hamtramck near Detroit, which itself has a strong Arab community that contributes to its diverse, multi-ethnic population.
The Detroit area has the largest concentration of Arab-speaking people anywhere in the United States. It includes people from virtually every country of the Middle East, from Egypt to Lebanon to Syria to Iraq to Iran.
In the 19th century, many of Michigan's immigrants were enticed by the burgeoning lumber industry. The vast expanse of old-growth white pines on the peninsula seemed to promise endless prosperity to loggers and timber barons alike. In its heyday, lumber was as lucrative for Michigan as the gold rush had been for California.
In the 1860s, in the 1870s, and 1880s, Michigan was the leading producer of lumber in the entire United States.
When the logs were sent down the river to the area where the sawmills were, sometimes as many as 20 different logging companies would have logs in this mix. They would brand each log like you would brand a cow. And like the Wild West, there were sometimes log rustlers who tried to steal someone else's logs, and they were punished very severely when they were caught. You just don't steal another man's logs.
By the early 20th century, however, Michigan's forests had been overharvested. Today, generations of conservation and replanting have replenished this resource, thanks in large part to a state forest system that has grown from a single small preserve in 1903 to some 4 million acres of trees.
And today, Michigan boasts the largest state system of any state in the Union. Thousands, if not millions of people flock to Michigan's woods to hike, to view nature, to just enjoy themselves in the outdoors.
Last time I was in Manistee, by the way, I was driving along and I saw an eagle come down over the bridge, lift a salmon out of the river, and went off to have supper. Now, that was very exciting, because when I was a kid, there were no eagles left. Now there are eagles.
The vast wildlife habitat provided by the Great Lakes and their tributary rivers also forms a natural 721-mile boundary between Michigan and its international neighbor, Ontario, Canada. For many years, the only way to get from one shore to the other was by ferry. But the growth of the car industry following World War I overburdened the ferry system's main crossing point on the Detroit River. The solution was the Detroit-Windsor Tunnel, an unparalleled engineering feat that defied the critics when it opened on November 1st, 1930. First, more than 700,000 tons of muddy silt had to be dredged from the river bottom. Then, working from both sides of the river simultaneously, 9 250-foot-long tubes, each weighing 3,500 tons, were lowered into place.
And when the work was finished and the two sections united, there was less than 1 inch of difference between the two.
The tunnel is unique.
This is still the only tunnel that goes between two countries, that goes under a river, that you can drive through.
And it's busy. Every day, some 17,000 cars and trucks travel through the tunnel.
The Detroit-Windsor International border is easily the busiest border between Canada and the United States.
All those cars would have made auto pioneer Henry Ford very, very happy. He built his empire just a few miles from the tunnel's entrance at the confluence of the Detroit and Rouge rivers. In the 1920s and 30s, Ford's Rouge plant was the largest and most sophisticated industrial complex in the world.
Perhaps Henry Ford's greatest vision was what became known simply as the Rouge, this massive factory that he built on the banks of the Rouge River in Dearborn. And he conceived the Rouge as a place where the raw materials that he would own, coal from his coal mines, ore from his ore mines, wood from his forests, would come together at this massive factory.
At its peak, the facility was 1.5 miles wide and over 1 mile long. More than 80,000 employees turned raw materials into Fords.
Along with the railroads and the huge ships that brought in these raw materials, he turned them back out, loaded them with cars, and shipped them around the world. That's the true genius of Henry Ford. He kept thinking about how do we work more effectively, more productively. And in fact, he reduced the costs of automobiles so everybody could afford one.
By creating the cheap automobile and making it abundant, by creating mass production, he created much of what became the 20th century.
As Michigan faces the challenges of the 21st century, it must balance its role as an industrial giant with that of a steward to a land of incomparable natural beauty.
Forests and the lakes of Michigan have been important since the first Native Americans settled there. The Song of Hiawatha is all about that region, life on Lake Michigan. And that's one of the great virtues of that place. You relate to nature. Again, your bare feet touch Mother Earth.
The White House may be home to presidents, but this state has a house that was home to a king. Every year, Memphis welcomes 650,000 visitors to Graceland Mansion at 3734 Elvis Presley Boulevard. Greetings from Tennessee, which became the 16th state to join the Union on June 1st, 1796. Today, it ranks 17th in population with nearly 6 million residents.
The state's very long, but because you think about Appalachian culture and you think about the Great Smoky Mountains, and they're the oldest mountain range in North America, and then you travel through the beautiful rolling hills of Nashville in the middle of the state, then you get to Memphis, where cotton was king. If you just travel that road, if you drive from Memphis to Nashville and Knoxville, you will see every conceivable kind of culture and music and background.
Those disparities have existed for generations. In the Civil War era, eastern Tennessee had strong pro-Northern sentiments. To the west, along the Mississippi River, Memphis was a major slave center, with a political temperament more akin to the Deep South. When the Confederacy was formed, Tennessee wavered. It was the last state to leave the Union, and the first state to be readmitted after the war. Tennessee's reluctance to secede reflected its history of service to the nation. From 1813 to 1815, the state's volunteer militia, commanded by native son Andrew Jackson, had distinguished itself, first in the Creek Indian War, and then against the British at the Battle of New Orleans.
Andrew Jackson is the reason that Tennessee is known as the volunteer state, because of his love of war and fighting, and his playing a major role in the War of 1812, and in recruiting volunteers, because the men loved to fight with Andrew Jackson.
One of Jackson's homegrown Tennessee volunteers went on to become a legend in his own time, Davy Crockett. After his battlefield service, Crockett turned to politics. Not surprisingly, that's when the line between the man and the myth began to blur.
Crockett was a product of popular culture. He was a product of basically the campaign literature that wanted to really depict him as someone who was of the common people. He becomes larger than life during his career in Congress.
Campaign flyers claimed that Crockett killed his first bear at the age of 3, that he preferred Davy to his given name David, and that he always wore a coonskin cap.
I think he really was, in many ways, more fictional than real in terms of that image, the coonskin cap and everything else.
Davy Crockett did, however, leave behind some authentic legacies.
The organization is called Direct Descendants and Kin of David Crockett. So when we have a reunion, at least 250 people show up. So there's quite a few descendants.
In its early history, most of what is now Tennessee belonged to the Cherokee Indian tribe. In fact, the state's name probably derives from a Cherokee settlement named Tennessee, which roughly translates as meeting place. It is a fitting description for the state today. Tennessee shares its borders with 8 other states, making it possible to reach 75% of the entire U.S. population in just a day's drive. Tennessee's central locale made Memphis a natural choice when FedEx picked a new transportation hub in the 1970s. Today, the city's airport has the largest cargo operation of any airport in the world. This proximity to major population centers has also made the Great Smoky Mountains the most visited national park in the country, attracting 9 million tourists a year.
The Smoky Mountains got its name because when you go out there and you look at the mountains, there's these low-lying kind of misty clouds that look like white smoke. It's really beautiful.
Although tourism is an important and growing industry here, the state's economy is powered by a wide variety of businesses, such as book publishing, healthcare, and
also the automobile industry. We have Nissan, we have Saturn, which draw in over $1.7 billion a year for the economy of Tennessee.
The best-known business in the state, however, is country music, which owes much of its success to Tennessee's insurance industry.
WSM Radio was started by an insurance company, and the call letters WSM stood for We Shield Millions, which was the slogan of National Life. And so, like a lot of companies in that day, they started a radio station to advertise their business. The Grand Ole Opry started in 1925 and was actually first known as the WSM Barn Dance, and later adopted the Grand Ole Opry name just a couple years later. In fact, the announcer came on the air and out of classical music programming and said, "You've been listening to selections largely heard from Grand Opera, and now we want to present the music of the Grand Ole Opry." And so that's how the name started. It stuck.
To accommodate the crowds clamoring to see the show, the Opry moved from the radio studio to Nashville's old Ryman Auditorium in 1943.
It becomes the home and eventually the Mecca for the Grand Ole Opry, and people from all over the world come here for the next 31 years to see the Grand Ole Opry, America's radio show.
The Grand Ole Opry moved to its own 4,400-seat theater in 1974. It is one of the largest broadcast studios in the world. In 1945, a young Opry fan named Sam Phillips became an announcer and engineer at a Memphis radio station. But his passion was the blues music that had flourished since the early 1900s in the city's clubs on Beale Street.
He recognized that there was a very large pool of talented musicians, and no one was recording them. So he opened up Sun Records, and he recorded what many historians call the first rock and roll record, in 1951, Jackie Brinston's Rocket 88.
Today, Phillips is revered as the father of rock and roll. He was the first to record Jerry Lee Lewis, Johnny Cash, Ike Turner, and of course, the King himself.
So we love Elvis, certainly I do and did. But Beale Street was the main street of Black America. And it was everything goes, everything happens in Beale Street. You know, Elvis, as a young man, hung out on Beale Street, and he hung out with B.B. King, and he heard all those licks. He heard the blues. And so that combination of the blues and gospel, you know, they say the blues and gospel had a baby, and they called it rock and roll.
From Beale Street to the Grand Ole Opry to Sun Records, there was often more flowing than just the music, thanks to a beloved Tennessee character.
Jack Daniels was a real, honest-to-God, living human being, not like a Betty Crocker or a Stay Puft Marshmallow Man. And he lived in a little town by the name of Lynchburg, Tennessee.
Jack Daniels started working in a whiskey distillery at the age of 7. By the ripe old age of 14, he had bought the company.
He had a flair for marketing. One of the things he did was put it in a square bottle. Another thing he did was come up with this Old No. 7 brand name. We have no idea the story behind the name, but that name has stuck, and today, Jack Daniel's Old No. 7 is the #1 selling whiskey around the world, and we have Jack to thank for that.
And how's this for irony? The whiskey that's a favorite from Toronto to Tokyo cannot be purchased in Jack Daniel's hometown. Lynchburg, it turns out, is located in a dry county. No alcohol for sale here. When 19th century ships sailed up the New England coast, the wind was at their backs, so they were traveling downwind, earning this northern state's coast the nickname Down East. Greetings from Maine, the 23rd state to join the Union, which it did on March 15, 1820. With 1.3 million residents, it ranks 40th in population.
When I was younger, what I loved most about Maine was the fact that I knew that the sun hit Maine before any place else in the United States. And I guess as a kid, you equate first with best. Maine's the best state. Over the years, I think that's still my opinion. You know, we are the beginning of the New World.
Maine is nearly as large as the other 5 New England states combined. Its dramatic terrain is the product of the Ice Age. Around 20,000 years ago, North America's last great continental glacier began to melt. It left behind the natural wonderland you'll find today, a kaleidoscope of bays, inlets, harbors, and more than 5,000 coastal islands. But spend a particular type of winter day in Maine, and you'd never guess that the Ice Age has been over for 100 centuries.
They call them lung stoppers. Take a deep breath and you can't catch it.
You've got to learn how to drive in the snow, plain and simple. A lot of snow. If it would snow in the morning as you woke up for school, school is not going to get postponed for the day. No chance.
Maine's harsh winters actually cost the state the distinction of being the site of the first permanent English settlement in New England. A colony was established by the Plymouth Company at Popham in 1607, just 3 months after Jamestown, Virginia was founded. But the bitter cold drove the northern settlers away just over a year later. The result? Maine not only lost a potential claim to fame, it didn't even get to be its own separate colony.
Although we were part of the original 13 colonies of the United States, we were the North District of Massachusetts. In other words, we were a colony of a colony, the 14th colony, as it were. We hated that.
Although the people here are commonly known as Mainers, those with a sense of humor prefer another nickname, maniacs. By nature, the locals also tend to be a bit skeptical of outsiders, who they generally describe as being from away.
From away is a great phrase, and it basically relates to a Maine-centric point of view. There's Maine, and then there's everywhere else.
Given the breathtaking ocean scenery, that attitude is understandable. Along Maine's nearly 3,500-mile coastline, you'll find more than 60 picturesque lighthouses. Most notably, the historic 80-foot Portland Head Light.
The first lighthouse built by the first Congress of the United States under the orders of the first president, George Washington. So in many ways, that light, which was lit for the first time in January 1791, is America's first lighthouse.
Maine is called the Pine Tree State, and even the most casual observer can see why. 90% of its land is covered by forest, a higher percentage than any other state. Where there are trees, of course, there's paper. Maine is the second leading producer in the nation. The state also churns out 90% of America's supply of wooden toothpicks. And if you ever have a blueberry stuck between your teeth, there's a 1 in 4 chance that it came from Maine, making it the largest blueberry producer in the world.
Though we are known for our blueberries, the state's signature food would be lobster.
Today, the sweet meat of this coveted crustacean is a delicacy. That wasn't always the case. In colonial times, lobster was considered poverty food, suitable only for prisoners and indentured servants. Some servants rebelled and had it put in their contracts that they would not be forced to eat lobster more than 3 times a week. Times have certainly changed. These days, more than 50 million pounds a year are caught off the Maine coast by the state's legendary lobstermen.
Lobstering can make you a good living, but it costs you a good part of your life to do. You are your own master, but you are only a partner with the sea.
On a good day, a Maine lobsterman will average 1 keeper for every trap he has in the water. And for law-abiding lobstermen, size does matter.
The lobster has to be a minimum of 3 1/4 inches across their back, what's called the carapace, from the eye socket to the edge of the back. And he's longer than 3 1/4, and then we can keep him.
Granted, anybody that has eaten a Florida lobster, and no slam on Florida, but eating a Florida lobster or even a West Coast lobster, and then you eat a Maine lobster, because they come from the cold waters of Maine, they always taste better.
For those 19th century mariners who developed a taste for alcohol with their lobster, the state wasn't exactly a haven. In 1851, the passage of the so-called Maine Law was a crucial victory for the early temperance movement. Its champion was the mayor of Portland, Neal Dow.
And his idea was that he would establish prohibition and he would reform Maine, and Maine would enter an era of unprecedented progress.
The law, however, was not aimed at everyone.
It was targeted at those people who could only buy drams, small shots, at these small grog shops. They couldn't afford anything else. Those were the places that were targeted by the Maine Law.
Opposition to the law turned violent when word spread that a supply of medicinal alcohol was being stored in the basement of Portland's City Hall.
Mayor Dow's many enemies got a mob up one evening in early June 1855. A lot of immigrants, many Irish, people that Dow made it very clear he didn't like. And they stormed City Hall to get at the medicinal liquor.
There's a crowd of 3,000 to 4,000 people out front of City Hall, literally trying to tear down City Hall.
Mayor Dow called out the city militia, the light blues. And as the crowd made another surge against the building, he ordered the militia to fire into his own townsmen. Neil Dow's militia wounded many and killed one man.
Although Neil Dow became known as the father of Prohibition, the rum riot effectively ended his political career. Some 55 years later, another Mainer would make his own mark on the national stage in a much more agreeable arena. In 1912, Leon Leonwood Bean, a 39-year-old outdoorsman from Freeport, Maine, created a new style of boot to keep his feet dry while hunting. It became so popular with his friends that he decided to offer it for sale.
The original catalog in 1912 was actually not so much a catalog as it was a flyer that had the one product, the Maine hunting shoe, on it.
Over the years, the LL Bean catalog expanded considerably. In addition to an ever-increasing product line, its artful images of the Maine wilderness have inspired many to visit the state.
The people want to see the real goods that they've seen presented in such attractive context, in such an authentic setting. And so a trip to Maine is not complete without a run to LL Bean.
I'm from Missouri. I've gotten the catalog for years, and now that I'm in Maine, I had to come to the LL Bean store and see it. And it's like the catalog coming to life.
Visitors here can still see craftsmen make Maine's signature Maine boot the old-fashioned way, by hand. The store has no locks. It's open 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, 365 days a year. And why not? The great outdoors never closes.
The sheer physical beauty of Maine, it's just immense. The leaves really do change as many colors as there are in the galaxy. It's just magnificently beautiful.
In 1904, this state hosted the first Olympic Games held outside of Europe, staged to coincide with the St. Louis World's Fair. Greetings from Missouri, the 24th state to join the Union, which it did on August 10, 1821. With 5.8 million residents, Missouri is the 18th most populous state in the nation. Most people call Missouri the Show Me State, an affectionate reference to its down-to-earth Midwestern skepticism.
You tell them something, you got to prove it to them.
You just can't fake it. You got to be for real.
You got to prove it to the Missourians. They're not going to just take your word for it. You got to show them that you're capable of doing whatever you say you can do.
Residents may be united in their skepticism, but they're divided about pronouncing the state's name.
One person down the street that I might know will say Missouri. I'll say Missouri.
And if you say Missouri, you're being very rural or very countrified.
This state is both Missouri and Missouri. People pronounce it differently depending on what part of the state they're from. Politicians use both pronunciations depending on what constituency they're trying to appeal to.
Politics is something Missouri folks know a thing or two about. They are better than any other state at picking presidents. In the past 26 national elections, Missouri has sided with the winner every time, except once, when they voted for Adlai Stevenson in 1956. Missouri's two major metropolitan areas, Kansas City and St. Louis, sit on opposite sides of the state and account for more than 3/4 of its industrial activity. Once considered a cow town, Kansas City rules the West. Today, it has the most fountains and boulevards in the world, outside of Rome and Paris. To the east, St. Louis claims one of the world's first skyscrapers, as well as the largest monument in the United States, the Gateway Arch. Measuring 630 feet at both its base and its peak, the arch was built to commemorate Missouri's pivotal role in America's westward expansion.
As a child here in St. Louis, I grew up with watching it being built. Presidents came here from FDR's time on to LBJ's to see it completed.
The capstone was inserted on October 28, 1965.
They weren't quite sure that it would go in at the right space, but it was just perfect from 1/4 inch to 1/4 inch.
The arch stands near the confluence of the Mississippi and Missouri rivers. the two great waterways that have long defined the state.
The only real natural boundary of Missouri that is clear and that everyone recognizes is the Mississippi River. Missouri, like most territories in the western United States, started as a square.
The shape of the state changed in 1811 after the New Madrid earthquake, the largest earthquake to ever strike the continental U.S.
One of the effects of the earthquake was to lead people to declare a lot of land in southeastern Missouri ruined.
A speculator named John Walker snatched up both the devastated territory and lands to the south of it. When Missouri joined the Union in 1821, Walker lobbied vigorously to have his holdings added to the new state.
When Missouri was getting to be a state, he had an enormous amount of power and wealth in land, and he was able to get his section put in to Missouri becoming a state in 1821 because he knew what that would mean for him, the price of his land and the value.
It was Walker's annexed land, some of which had belonged to Arkansas, that gave Missouri its distinctive boot heel. In 1836, the shape of the state changed again, courtesy of William Clark.
William Clark is really the dominant figure in Missouri's early history. People, of course, know him now as Meriwether Lewis's sidekick on the Lewis and Clark expedition. But after that expedition returned, he was dispatched back to Missouri, and he was a territorial official, an Indian agent. William Clark signed more Indian treaties than any other American official.
One of those treaties expanded the state's northwestern corner. In 1816, Clark convinced the Iowa, Sauk, and Fox tribes to move west of the Missouri River to accommodate white settlers. The cost? A mere $5,500. The new section of the state was larger than Delaware and Rhode Island combined. The relocation of the native population provided an opening for further trade and settlement. Missouri's rivers provided the means via steamboats that first appeared in the region around 1820.
Steamboats enabled Missouri to be at the hub of a continental trading network that could go up the Missouri River to the Continental Divide and could go down the Mississippi River. So naturally, this was very much a commercial nexus for the United States.
One of the highest paid professional people in early America would have been a pilot on a steamboat. It was such a respected vocation.
The best-known riverboat pilot to emerge from Missouri was Samuel Clemens, who grew up in the river town of Hannibal.
Samuel Clemens is, of course, a product of that riverboat culture. And the young man who becomes Mark Twain, in many ways, learns about Missouri, learns about America, learns about language itself by working and traveling on steamboats.
Even Clemens' pen name was drawn from his Missouri riverboat experience.
Riverboats have a shallow draft, and they can only take a certain depth before they ground it. And so marking Twain was actually to measure the depths, fathom-wise, of the river.
The riverboats gave westward-bound pioneers easy access to the trailheads in northwestern Missouri.
As large numbers of migrants started heading west, they could come through Missouri, which everyone knew was the point of embarkation for points farther west. You could get the equipment you needed, you could find guides, you could find information, you could gain the knowledge that you needed in order to survive what was really a terrifying experience for many people. They didn't know what they would find in the West.
Among the early immigrants to the region were French and German settlers who arrived with a love of the land and a knack for cultivating it. As a result, the state became a world leader in an industry few people today would equate with Missouri: winemaking.
Missouri was one of the top 3 wine-producing regions in the world. You know, France was #1, upstate New York was #2, and Missouri was #3.
In the 1860s, France's vineyards were nearly wiped out by a plague of Phylloxera louse, an insect that attacks the roots of the grapevine. Missouri came to the rescue.
And they discovered that the grapes growing in Missouri were hybrids, and they were not susceptible to this disease. So Missouri grapes were shipped to France so that they could, in turn, graft these grapes with theirs and make the strong rootstock. And it did. It saved the French grapes.
The state's vineyards continued to produce fine wines, though not on the scale of the 19th century. As it turned out, however, Missouri was also the perfect place to produce another beverage, one that still dominates world markets today:
the conditions in St. Louis and the limestone caves made it especially conducive to brewing and storing beer.
In 1852, German immigrant Adolphus Busch and his father-in-law, Eberhard Anheuser, set out to revolutionize the beer industry. Their first move was to incorporate cutting-edge science.
Adolphus Busch realized the value of pasteurization. He had learned of these efforts by Louis Pasteur when he was over in Germany and Europe studying brewing techniques. So he was the first American brewer to pasteurize beer and the first brewer to bottle beer on an extensive basis.
To expand sales, Busch created the first national beer distribution system.
What he did is he looked at sending his beer throughout the country, particularly out into the West because there was less competition. So he decided he would put railside ice houses where they were needed strategically so that he could ship his beer, the unpasteurized beer, as well as the bottled pasteurized beer, in his rail cars as far as to the West Coast or down into Arizona or Texas.
By 1901, Anheuser-Busch was indeed the king of beers, outselling every other brewery in America. Then came 1920 and 13 years of prohibition. The company survived by making cheap products like baker's yeast and ice cream. When the 18th Amendment was finally repealed, Anheuser-Busch delivered a special gift to the Capitol building, a wagon load of Budweiser beer, pulled, of course, by a team of Clydesdales. Today, Budweiser and Bud Light are the best-selling beers in the world. And though Anheuser-Busch has grown into a global conglomerate, it remains true to Missouri, keeping its headquarters in St. Louis. Today, Missouri strives to maintain a careful balance between social, business, and environmental concerns, as evidenced by world-class universities, public sports facilities, and wildlife preserves. It all makes the Show Me State a place that is definitely worth calling home.
I've been to a lot of places around the United States, and I've never felt as comfortable as I do right here in the state of Missouri. This is always going to be a state where they say, you show me you're a good person, I'm going to treat you like you're a good person.
In the late 1800s, prospectors in this state often paid for their drinks in gold dust. Crafty bartenders scoured the saloon floors, hoping to recover a few fallen gold particles. Greetings from South Dakota, the 40th state. It entered the Union along with North Dakota on November 2nd, 1889. With 750,000 people, South Dakota ranks 46th in population.
South Dakota is unique, and I have a far greater appreciation of it and what it's meant to me now than I did when I was growing up there. You do feel, I think, forevermore a South Dakotan if you've grown up there, as I did, and the values that I have were formed there.
Those values are definitely small town. South Dakota only has about 10 people per square mile, and most towns have fewer than 1,000 residents. Unless you're in Sturgis, whose population swells to over 500,000 every August, when thousands of Harley-Davidson motorcycles come roaring in for the annual rally. The event began in 1938 with just 9 riders. Today, it's estimated that the festival generates 95% of the town's annual income. Mitchell, South Dakota, one of the state's larger towns with just over 14,500 residents, made its mark as the proud home of the world's only exhibition hall decorated entirely with grain.
The Corn Palace, that's the world's largest outdoor bird feeder.
A local tradition since 1892, the Corn Palace murals are redesigned and redecorated each spring. The amount of corn needed equals the output of more than 150 acres of farmland.
Whether it's great art or not, I don't know, but it's like the dog dancing on his hind legs. You marvel that it's done it all.
But nature alone created South Dakota's greatest scenic wonder. 244,000 forbidding acres of buttes, pinnacles, and spires. Native Americans called it Mekosico. To us, it's the Badlands, a name that needs little explanation.
Bad land to travel over. It's almost impossible to cross it.
But there is definitely more beauty than bad in the Badlands.
If you can catch it at sunrise or sunset after there's been a rain, the colors are simply glorious.
Buffalo still roam the territory just outside the Badlands. It was these herds that attracted Kevin Costner to film Dances with Wolves here. The movie told the story of the Lakotas, who in the Treaty of Laramie were deeded extensive lands west of the Missouri River in 1868. The federal government hoped to establish a lasting peace by granting the tribes ownership forever of territory the natives considered the sacred center of the world, the Black Hills. Just 6 years later, however, Lieutenant Colonel George Armstrong Custer led a cavalry expedition into the region and confirmed reports of gold there. As the news spread, prospectors rushed into the territory in defiance of the treaty with the Lakota.
Miners were coming by the droves into Deadwood Gulch. By the summer, there was anywhere from 5,000 to 10,000 miners that were hovering in the creeks throughout the Black Hills.
Since 1876, the area has been one of the largest gold-producing regions in America. The dynamite and drills that helped mine Black Hills gold were put to a more artistic use on a granite cliff called Mount Rushmore. American-born artist Gutzon Borglum was commissioned by Congress to sculpt the 6,200-foot monument. He and 400 workmen began construction in 1927.
When I was a very small child, when they first opened Mount Rushmore in the 1940s, we drove from an Army base where my dad was working up there and had picnics before they had the infrastructure around it.
The monument, which depicts the faces of George Washington, Thomas Jefferson, Theodore Roosevelt, and Abraham Lincoln, took 14 years and $1 million to create. But controversy has long swirled around this shrine to democracy, with the Lakota disputing ownership rights to the land on which it was built. In 1970, members of the American Indian Movement, a Native American activist organization, staged a protest here.
What they were set about, and still are, and justifiably so, is the breaking of the Treaty of the Fort Laramie, which gave this land to them. Russell Means and his folks came in and staged a protest.
In 1977, the U.S. government offered $17.5 million to the Native Americans as compensation for the Black Hills. The offer was refused.
And still refused today to accept that money because this land's not for sale.
The 1970 action was just the latest skirmish in the dispute. In 1948, the Lakota chiefs had approached sculptor Korczak Ziolkowski, who had previously worked on Mount Rushmore, and asked him to create a monument to one of their heroes.
The Indians chose Crazy Horse to be carved here, and I think it was as much because of the way he died. He was stabbed in the back while he was under a flag of truce by a white soldier at Fort Robinson, Nebraska.
Using tribal funds, Ziolkowski privately acquired a granite mountain ridge 17 miles south of Mount Rushmore, with the intention of carving an even larger sculpture.
A white trader who asked Crazy Horse, where are your lands now, Crazy Horse? You've been defeated. And Crazy Horse pointed over his horse's head and said, my lands are where my dead lie buried.
He was a great leader, a great warrior. A lot of people come here, and once they see what he's all about, they go away with a great respect.
Ziolkowski died of a heart attack in 1982 and was buried near the monument. His wife and children have taken over the project, which is still privately funded. Only the head is finished, but once complete, it will be the largest sculpture in the world.
I honestly believe that the great monument in South Dakota is the land itself, especially the high plains. It's the American savanna, nothing less than that, with the great artery of the Missouri River running down through the middle of it. And I go back now and stand at dawn or at dusk in utter awe, not just of the land and the wildness of it, but of the people who came out there and said, I can survive here.